Kero koto. My name is JT, Dr. Jagadish Thakur. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Auckland in Aotearoa, New Zealand. What is environment, and what are the scientific aims and social vision for scholars studying environment have been foundational questions in our field of environmental communication. Many scholars trace the origins of development of the field of environmental communication in 1980s in North America, Europe, and elsewhere. But this elsewhere makes up a substantial portion of the world. How do these people from elsewhere, countries and continents, conceive, speak of, and act on environmental issues? This research is an attempt to illustrate an alternative theorizing about environmental communication from the global south, one that is rooted in the culture and lived experiences of the poor, the marginalized, and the indigenous communities. Environmentalism is often construed as a full stomach phenomena, a luxury only the rich can afford. Postulating the emergence of post-materialistic value, Engelhardt argued that the rise of green or environmental protection movement in the 1960s in the global north was a result of shift from materialistic to post-materialistic values, a change from prioritizing sustenance and safety towards self-expression and quality of life. This shift was primarily attributed to the unprecedented levels of safety and security after the two world wars. This view was widely shared among scholars, even celebrated Marxists, much to the disappointment of some of my colleagues, policymakers in the West, such as the USAID International Aid Development Program. A primary area of study in environmental communication is evaluating the evolution of environmental policies and public participation in enacting and implementing such policies. The formulation of environmentalism as a full stomach phenomena has implications on environment and conservation policy making process and its communication. Central in this configuration is that humans and nature are incompatible, and emptying the indigenous and native communities best serves environmental goals. In its modern avatar, for example, is carbon credits used as part of global climate agreement, in where governments and industries, primarily from the global north, buy carbon credits from poorer countries by funding projects such as tree planting, generation of green energy sources, among others. But several reviews of carbon credits projects show that they not only fail to offset the amount of pollution, but they also disrupt local ecologies and local economies in the process. Ultimately, the polluters get a guilt-free pass of keeping emitting CO2, while local communities suffer from natural loss, such as loss or decline of agriculture, fishing, financial loss, social mistrust, and loss of customary rights over forest resources, and long-term livelihood impacts such as decline in community health and nutrition. But around the same time as Engelhardt propounded the post-materialistic values, halfway across the world, in the foothills of Himalayas in India, poor farmers hacked trees to protect them from logging contractors, which were sanctioned by the Forest Department of the Indian government. The primary driver of the Chipko movement, here is a picture shared by Emma Watson on Instagram, thanking the women for protecting forests and trees, was not to protect trees and forests for their own sake, but to protect the village economy, the sustenance of these natural resources provided to local communities, and community rights over common resources. In the words of the poor rubber tapper and union organizer in Brazil, Chico Mendes, at first I thought I was fighting to save rubber trees. Then I thought I was fighting to save the Amazon rainforest. Now I realize I'm fighting for humanity. Environmental communication from elsewhere has produced interesting and important work on environmental communication rooted in gender, social, political, environmental citizenship, and environmental justice movements. Just to give an example from India and how it is connected to the broader environmental reporting during that time, the publication of the Center for Science and Society's The State of Environmental Report, the first of which was published in 1982, documented the environmental degradation through government policies from the colonial times to the modern democracy. The second report by Center for Science and Environment 2 years later was translated into Indian languages, resulting in a wake-up call to an insular academia, a half-blind state, and a somanent public as Ramchandra Guha called it. These reports were inspired by a prior publication of State of the Malaysia's Environment, and these reports together later inspired the World Watch Institute's State of the World reports. One of the most popular and influential of these CSE reports is their Global Warming in an Unequal World, differentiating between survival emissions and the luxury emissions of the rich, after the World Resource Institute found that poor and developing countries like India are equally culpable for global emissions around the Rio Conventions in 1992. Apart from material basis of rights to ecological resources, environmental communication from the South also highlights traditional values in contrast to post-materialistic values as a basis to understand environmental concern. These traditional values refer to a distinctive spiritual connotation of environment as a guardian, which needs guarding in return to sustain the values and tradition of indigenous communities from New Zealand as far as to India. The disappearance of these environmental resources, and I quote Uttaran Datta here, are threats to spiritual and political identities, cultural tapestries, and the very existence of indigenous people. These indigenous community members' struggle to protect their environment is one that is derived from their identity and material conditions. According to Henson and Cox, of the three major domains of communication process, production, content, and audiences, it is the media representation that has attracted the bulk of communication research. This probably highlights the continuing of environment as a hidden topic that the media somehow uncovers the public, and the public needs to be persuaded about. Here again, an examination of how mainstream and alternative community-owned media portray and communicate about environmental issues from the global South can provide some interesting theoretical impetus. Broa, for example, researching on the media coverage of human-elephant conflicts in India, found that while regional media emphasize the role of poor governance and national media on negative impacts of large-scale development projects, international media emphasize population growth in alignment with the metaphor of India's teeming millions, squaring the conservation cycle and a population circle. Other scholars show that community-owned media can enhance local communities' participation in and management of environmental resources. Thinking about future directions in environmental communication theory and practice is that a substantial body of theoretical and empirical evidence indicates that the poor are not only equally concerned, but probably more concerned and equally participate in environmental protection movements because of their sustenance is relied on these immediate environmental resources. A theoretical framework focused on listening to voices of the disenfranchised communities and based on individual and community rights or access to local common resources will enrich the field of environmental communication. It will help in finding solutions to intractable global problems of climate change, biodiversity loss in a just and fair manner, commensurate with the disproportional impacts faced by the poor and the historical and prevailing differences between the global rich and the poor in continuation of environmental problems. Peers and colleagues at Cornell University identified environmental belief paradox, or belief that the most vulnerable are least concerned about environment, even though they're actually more concerned. But this environmental belief paradox not only permeates in the US public, but also extends to scholars because of our lack of broader understanding of what constitutes as an environmental issue. Yet the subaltern classes, manual workers, indigenous people, and poor in general are often the first to defend the environment in which they work and live, and from which they get their livelihood. This concept or conceptualization of environment relating to certain themes results in a narrow and sometimes prejudiced views about how environment is interpreted and communicated in Global South. For example, an unproductive framework is understanding environmental problems as resulting due to population bomb, the title of an influential work by Stanford University professor Paul Ehrlich, written on suggestion from David Brower, the then executive director of Sierra Club. In contrast, a Bangladeshi diplomat, according to Guha, never failed to mention in the UN meeting that a single child born in America was equivalent to 70 Indonesian children or Indian children. After visiting an American supermarket, the diplomat had updated his figures as follows. an American dog or a cat is to be ecologically damaging as a dozen Bangladeshi children. Even today, this difference in per capita pollution persists. In just 2.3 days, an average American or Australian emits as the average Malayan or Nigerian in a year. More than a decade ago, in the inaugural issue of Communication Journal, Environmental Communication Journal, Robert Cox challenged the scholars about their principal ethical duty in the field of environmental communication, which he termed as a crisis discipline. But environment is not only a source of crisis, but is also of care and a source of collective identity and activism, as scholars have recently pointed in environmental communication. Future research in the field of environmental communication is both inviting and intimidating. While a growing body of research using feminist, post-colonial, racial, ethnicity lens point to how environment is conceptualized and negotiated, there's a greater need for research from Global South about issues that they are facing. Environmental communication is not just a study of human relationship with non-human entities, but it's also a study of inhuman relationships with fellow humans and non-humans, and to ways to make it right. Environmental communication in the spirit is the spirit of equity communication, equity in right over ecological resources, equity of participation in environmental policies and governance, and equity in voice in media. I'll be happy to respond to any questions or suggestions for my research. Thank you so much again.